You know by now that we're all about the journey. June's journey, that is. I feel this game was made for us specifically. It's the closest I've come to feeling like I've been dropped in the middle of a mystery novel set in the 1920s.
That's because you get to play as June, a globe-trotting flapper/amateur sleuth who lives to solve mysteries. You get to visit all sorts of fascinating places, from Paris to Cuba. You beat levels by identifying hidden objects in the scene. And we found that the more we play, the sharper our observational skills become.
The game is delightful, and a wonderful way to relax. I'll often pull my phone out and play it when I've got a free moment, like I'm on hold with an archive, or I'm waiting for a courthouse to open up in the morning. I'm currently on Chapter 16, meaning I'm searching for the son of June's housekeeper, who's on the run from New Orleans gamblers and the police. It's a wild time.
We know our audience is filled with folks who love a good mystery. Now is your chance to try your hand at being a sleuth yourself. Discover your inner detective when you download June's Journey for free today on iOS and Android. Content warning. This episode contains discussion of violence and murder. Recently, we've been covering a murder trial that has been taking place down in Nashville, Indiana, in Brown County. We got interested in this case because the attorney, or rather one of the attorneys representing the defendant, Randy Small, is Andy Baldwin, who's also one of the attorneys representing Richard Allen in the Delphi case. So before we go into the most recent developments in this trial, I think we should take a moment just to refresh our recollections of the basic facts in this case. And it's kind of a strange case in that the basic facts are agreed to by both sides. It's just how they interpret them and what context they put around them.
Back in 2021, there appears to have been some sort of ongoing dispute between two neighbors, Randy Small and a man named Robert or Bob Adair. They both lived on Helm Road in Brown County in Indiana. Essentially, one day, Randy Small shot Bob Adair in the head with a shotgun, completely obliterating his head.
At the time this occurred, Randy Small was in sort of a tractor vehicle, and Bob Adair was in a truck, a pickup truck that was located on Randy Small's property. And as you're here, the prosecution keeps focusing on the fact that at the time of the shooting, victim Bob Adair's hands were folded on his lap and his foot was on the brake pedal. So the question that is under debate is, was this murder or was it something else? And the defense attorneys, Andy Baldwin and Kelly Pyle, suggested that it might be something else, that in fact it was self-defense. And if it was self-defense, then perhaps it would be justified. So that is what the whole trial was about. What was in Randy Small's mind when this occurred? What was happening when this occurred? What was the context? Well, the trial wrapped up. We went to the last couple of days, and we thought we would tell you what happened.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases.
We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is Andy Baldwin for the defense. Randy Small and the murder of Bob Adair. Closing arguments and verdict. Before we get too far into this, I just want to include a personal note. I don't have permission to reveal details. I didn't ask, so I won't. But I wanted to mention that one of the witnesses in the final days of this case, as this individual was testifying, I became aware to my surprise that it was actually an in-law of one of my oldest friends. So that was a bit surreal.
Indiana, it's a small town.
But with that said, we went back to the trial on Monday. We missed...
Which is July 24th.
Monday, July 24th. We missed a couple of days last week. In those couple of days, my understanding is that some of Randy Small's brothers testified, and also one of the detectives who led the investigation testified.
Brian Schrader.
Exactly.
And Clyde and Ernie Small. This is a situation where, honestly, we really enjoy doing court reporting, and I think you and I would prefer to be doing a lot of that, but we also, having to run the podcast, essentially, we can't necessarily always go to every day of the court session, but they're so interesting, and personally, I feel like there's sometimes such a removal between finalized true crime products and the actual necessities of the criminal justice system. And I think the real stuff is more interesting. And so hopefully learning along with us in this process of sort of reporting, we can all basically come to a better understanding of how some things work and how trials go and the roles of prosecutors, the judge, and defense attorneys.
It's a fascinating process, and it's a shame these trials don't get more coverage. I believe we were the only representatives of any media at this trial.
Yeah, I don't believe it's possible people from other outlets went on days that we were not there. That's very possible. And so I would not necessarily conclude that we were the only people going there to cover this. And it's also possible that others are doing coverage just by like kind of calling in or getting statements. But it's such an interesting case. And I mean, in jury selection, people were shocked that this had happened. And that just tells me, unfortunately, there's been such a gunning of local news. And it's a shame because there's probably cases going on like this in your backyard, wherever you are listening to this, that are not receiving the coverage they deserve. And that's not because local journalists don't care. It's just because they're spread so thin. They're hardworking people. They're having to run to everything because there are just fewer of them now.
Exactly. It's a real shame. So one thing we didn't mention in our recap of events that I think is worth mentioning now is that the shooting of Bob Adair happened at approximately 2:00 in the afternoon. And this was not reported to law enforcement until about 10 hours later. And it actually was reported by one of Randy Small's brothers, and he reported it to state troopers in another town. But we'll get to all of that later. The first witness on the stand on Monday, July 24th, was a man named Chad Williams. Who was that, and what was his story?
He was a law enforcement officer.
Yes, he's actually now with Bartholomew County, which is my home county.
Yeah, there you go. So, but he previously was with Brown County and had a good amount of experience there, it seems. And so he was one of the responding officers. Officers in this situation were confronted with a sort of chaotic scene, not because there was a lot happening with Randy Small, but because there were essentially communication issues. So here's what happened. Randy Small's brothers were made aware in communications with Randy Small that, you know, he was claiming to have killed somebody and shot his neighbor, and was basically, they got the indication there was talk of suicide by cop. So concerned for their brother, there's hours that pass. So some of the timeline here is somewhat controversial, but at some point that evening, Clyde Small gets in touch with Indiana State Police troopers at the Pendleton Post to the northeast of Indianapolis. They then get in contact with Brown County Dispatch, which is many miles to the south of Indianapolis. But they're the ones who initially hear about this. And then they have to get in contact with people on the ground, who then have to go out to Helm Road,
which is where Randy Small lives. Chad Williams, the first witness on Monday, was one of the initial responding officers. When he arrives, Randy Small is basically engaged in a standoff inside his house. He doesn't want to come out. Eventually, law enforcement does persuade him to come out. He surrenders himself, and they decide basically, let's take him to a hospital for evaluation, primarily a mental health evaluation to see what's going on with him. And they load him into a vehicle, and he goes away.
And that's all captured on body camera.
Yes.
We actually are able to view body camera from this officer and other officers who are engaged in this. And, you know, it kind of shows exactly what happened. It shows Randy's demeanor when he was taken into custody. It shows what police did to get him to kind of, you know, surrender.
After he leaves the scene, police, including the witness, make a grisly discovery. They see a red truck, and inside the truck, they see the headless body of Bob Adair. And at that point, the decision is made, let's radio to this ambulance, and let's not send him to the hospital. Let's place him under arrest for murder.
And so herein lies a lot of what the defense was talking about during this trial. They don't debate that Randy Small is the one who shot Bob Adair. They're not saying no, it was someone else who came out of the woods and did this. They're saying yes, it was Randy. But there was a self-defense element to this. And basically what they're saying and what they're, you know, talking to the jury about is that responding officers, maybe not out of maliciousness, maybe out of confusion initially and then making up their minds too quickly later on, are saying basically that they never really investigated this as a possible self-defense angle. And so evidence is lost to that effect.
Yes, and that actually comes up in the cross-exam. And the cross-examination of this witness was done by attorney Kelly Pyle. She kept it pretty short and simple. She said, were you told that Randy's brother Clyde said that this was an act of self-defense? And he said, yes, he was told this. And she said, well, did you take a measurement as to how far from the road the truck was? Because the truck that Bob Adair was in was on Randy Small's property. He'd actually driven his truck into a field. So how far into the field was it driven? The answer is we don't know because that measurement was not taken. Next witness on Monday, she continued with another piece of the story. It was a woman named Rachel Williams who works as an EMT, and she was the person inside the, I guess basically an ambulance with Randy Small after he'd been taken into custody after he surrendered himself.
So basically the prosecutor is calling all these different people who each have a different piece of the story and are able to put it together in a way that informs the jury at every turn what exactly happened here.
The witness after that was a witness we'd actually heard from last week in one of the days we were there. This was Bob Adair's daughter, Lauren Adair Horace. What did she have to say? She
basically once again testified to her father's character and was noting that he was a peaceful man. He was not the kind of person to pick a fight, start a fight. He was, in fact, a Buddhist and was inseparable from his Buddhist prayer beads and often hung out at the Tibetan temple nearby. And he was just known for this. This was who he was. He was an active bluegrass musician in a band, the White Lightning Boys. And just kind of giving the jury a sense of who was lost, but also, is this the kind of person who would make one fear for their life in a confrontation, perhaps? Or is this the kind of guy who would actively avoid a confrontation if possible?
One of the details she gave was especially memorable to me. She said that Bob Adair never had any locks on his door at home. Because if he figured if anybody really wanted something that he had, it would be better off for him in the long run if they just came in and took it. Because otherwise, they'd probably break down the door and cause all sorts of damage. It'd be a real pain to fix.
I've read in some previous news coverage that Bob Adair is actually responsible for carving some of the, woodworkings or doors in Nashville, which is the seat of Brown County. And in fact, one tipster sent us a note saying that he may have done so for even the courthouse doors. I don't have that confirmed. I'm not sure if that's the case, but I think based on what we saw from people who were kind of sitting in on the trial at different times, you had a lot of people it was very sad. And I have to imagine that some of those people were there for Bob Adair, that he was friends or kin with some of these people. It was very poignant to see that, because you have people kind of tearing up. I mean, this is a very real tragedy to people, and they're continuing to feel this man's loss.
Exactly. And of course, the defense is still obligated to present a defense for their client, which meant that they had to cross-examine the deceased man's daughter. And in this case, Kelly Pyle, again, did it. And the point she made in her cross-examination was basically, well, you say he was a very peaceful man who avoided conflict. Were you ever present when he had conversations with Randy Small about the issues that divided them? And she was not.
And that was the only question she asked, I believe.
I believe so.
So very brief, not a confrontational cross. That makes sense. I think when you're dealing with victims' family members, typically, if it's just sort of more of a character witness, especially testifying to the person's character, you don't want to make that a huge argument, because that can kind of look mean to the jury, but also indicating to the jury maybe you didn't know about this other thing going on.
I think Kelly Pyle did a great job.
Yeah, it was sensitive for sure. You have to ask hard questions sometimes, so I get that too.
The next witness was another character witness for Bob Adair. It was a woman named Alex Fettig. Again, she spoke about how, Bob Adair was one of my best friends. I knew him for like 31 years. He's the sort of person who would walk away from a fight. And then again, we see Kelly Pyle coming back with a cross-examination, which she says, well, were you ever present for conversations between him and Randy Small? And the answer was she was not.
We've talked a lot about how great HelloFresh is when it comes to meals. They really want you to have it all, free time and delicious food. That's why they take care of all the meal planning and even ship the ingredients right to your door, so you've got everything you need to make a wonderful meal for yourself and your family. But let's chat a moment about a side of HelloFresh we didn't know about ourselves until very recently.
I'll be honest, I don't just eat at meal times. During the day or when I'm relaxing in the evening, I like to munch on snacks or sides. And I assumed that was something HelloFresh could not help me with. So I would still have to trudge out to the grocery store and stand in line to get those sorts of treats. But I was wrong.
Let me tell you about HelloFresh Market. It lets you shop online and take your pick from a curated selection of over 100 items, including all sorts of tasty treats and desserts. And it will all be added to your weekly HelloFresh delivery. It's the best of meal kits and online grocery shopping combined in one weekly box.
This is another great reason to try out HelloFresh. And remember, Murder Sheet listeners get a special discount.
Go to hellofresh.com/msheet50 and use code msheet50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, go to hellofresh.com/msheet50 and use code msheet50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Try out America's #1 meal kit today. We are so delighted to work with our sponsor, Brilliant Earth. This is a company that offers some of the most brilliant and romantic engagement rings and wedding bands out there, all the while ensuring a commitment to ethical sourcing and sustainability.
If you're looking to get married or to become engaged, or even if you're just searching for a special piece of fine jewelry, you have to check out their website. They make browsing so easy.
They even let you design your own perfect engagement ring, or you can shop by style. I love the delicate willow rings, along with the 3-stone Nadia rings and the classic freesia rings. It's so hard to choose.
And you don't have to worry about the ethical implications of your purchase. Your special gift, your engagement ring, your wedding band should never be tarnished by the idea that the gems or materials came from an abusive system.
See, Brilliant Earth has a commitment to beyond conflict-free diamonds. That means one thing. They only accept diamonds from mining operations in countries that strictly follow international labor, trade, and environmental standards. Fewer than 1% of other diamond suppliers meet Brilliant Earth standards.
You can feel good about your purchase, knowing that you're supporting a brand that actually cares about its ethical impact. and is committed to fostering better standards in the jewelry business.
Check out all of their beautiful pieces at brilliantearth.com. That's brilliantearth.com.
The next witness was an analyst from the Indiana State Police, a woman named Ashley Luther. She talked about a variety of items she had tested from Randy Small's home, I believe. She tested them for blood, and on most of the items, she didn't find blood. I think the one item she tested that did have blood on it was she took a swab from the tractor that Randy Small had been in at the time of the shooting, and it had some blood from a single person, and that person was Robert Adair. And there was no cross-examination of her. Now, tell us about this next witness.
So the witness after that was Dr. James Jacoby. He is a forensic pathologist. He has done, by his count, 11,000 autopsies and has been an expert witness 200 times.
He did not, however, perform the autopsy in this case. The autopsy of Bob Adair was performed by a Dr. Socio. Tell us about Dr. Socio.
Well, that was a bit of a weird moment in this trial that still baffles me, and I suppose we should probably get to Googling, but we're very tired right now. But basically, Dr. Jacoby indicated that nobody knows his whereabouts, this other doctor.
Yes, Dr. Jacoby said Dr. Socio left the state of Indiana last October, and his whereabouts are unknown.
So a mystery within this case that remains bizarre. But Dr. Jacoby was an incredibly important witness to this case.
Yes. And we should strike, even though he didn't perform the autopsy was extensively documented with photographs and notes. And Dr. Jacoby reviewed all of those. So
it's basically, he's the guy to interpret it for the jury. He's not the one who did it, but he has all of the scientific notes and all, all the recorded, every bit of that was recorded, so he can basically walk the jury through the findings and interpret them himself as well as an expert. But yeah, that was a strange. I hope that other doctor's okay.
Some of his testimony was a bit gruesome, by which I mean he went into a lot of details, and we were shown a bunch of pretty gruesome pictures.
Yes, and this time I felt like I should bear witness to some of this awful things that happened to Mr. Adair. And so I did end up viewing the photographs. I think I mentioned in the last episode that I actually looked away and Kevin was the only one who looked at them. But they're just awful. It's just awful to see the results of such violence with a gun and how devastating. It just drives home how devastating this whole thing is. And to think about this person, that this is what has become of them, and they have a family who loved them and friends who adored them. And it just, I don't know, it just drives the whole thing home of how important and how depressing and how awful this is.
For me, here's the real big takeaway from Dr. Jacoby's rather impressive testimony. In the photograph taken in the truck of the headless body of Bob Adair, we see him with his hands folded, one over the other. And we see him with his foot on the brake pedal. And Dr. Jacoby made very clear that these movements of his body had to have occurred before the shot was fired. So in other words, at the moment the shot was fired, Bob Adair's hands were folded and his foot was on the brake of the truck.
It looked like it was a very mild pose. It was a very non-aggressive pose.
And that's crucial because the defense is a self-defense claim. And so if a person, you think, well, a truck can be a weapon because I can take my truck and I can drive it at somebody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A very formidable weapon at that.
But this man had his foot on the brake pedal, so the truck was not in movement at that time. He didn't have any weapons in the truck, and there was no weapons in his hands. They were just folded over each other.
And he didn't, it was not like the body was slumped over with one arm outstretched for the glove compartment.
Yes.
So that, I know, the kind of the prosecution's mantra was a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that's the picture they were referring to. And then Dr. Jacoby being able to bring some of the medical expertise behind that was also valuable because it's basically contextualizing the picture.
Right. So the cross-examination was by Andy Baldwin. And I think the important point he tried to make was he said basically, Dr. Jacoby, you reviewed this autopsy. So maybe you could tell what was happening at the exact moment Bob Adair died. But you can't tell from an autopsy what happened days before Bob Adair's death. You can't tell from an autopsy what happened hours before the death, or even seconds before the death. And of course, Dr. Jacoby agreed to that. And I believe the point Attorney Baldwin was trying to make there was that we don't want to strip this act from its context.
Yes.
That maybe things may have been happening around the shooting that may have inspired Randy Small to think his life was in danger.
And that's a very fair point, and I think he raised it well.
The prosecution in this case was handled by Brown County prosecutor Ted Adams and his associate Rob Seet,
who's the deputy prosecutor.
And after Andy Baldwin made his point was, you can't tell what was happening even seconds before the shooting. Ted Adams stands up and says basically, well, doctor, you can tell exactly where his hands and his feet were at the time of death, can't you? And the doctor said, yes, he could.
Yes.
And that was the end of the case that the prosecution presented. And the defense didn't even present a case.
And now I think we were talking a bit about that at the time, and some people may interpret that in some way. I think, I guess I was wondering, before we get into the verdict and, the concluding statements, first, I suppose, what is the strategy for not putting on? Because I think some people might hear that and they might be like, well, they just gave up. But no, that's not the case. There's actually a pretty good reason that a defense strategy would actually look like that.
Well, the thing to remember is the defense doesn't have to prove anything.
No.
All they have to do is basically they have no obligation at all. The obligation is on the state to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The state has to prove its case. If they don't prove its case, the defense wins. So it's not uncommon for defense attorneys to feel, well, the state put on such an awful case, I don't even need to put on a defense.
I don't know if the situation here, I mean, we don't know because we just don't know, but I don't necessarily think it was in response to a very weak case by the prosecution, but maybe it's about conserving energy to pick apart the prosecution's case, highlight the flaws with it that can leave room for reasonable doubt rather than putting all your energy into... Because maybe you feel that you can actually prove reasonable doubt just with what the state is putting out there, and that will be enough.
Exactly. And I didn't mean to suggest this was a weak case, anything but. In fact, this morning in closing arguments, first closing argument was presented by Deputy Prosecutor Rob Seet, who did a wonderful job. And one of the things he did very early on in this argument was to say, hey, I have at least 22 reasons why this guy is guilty.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell them all to you right now.
Yeah, that was intense. And, but, I think I just want to highlight that that's one of those things that, lay people such as myself might look at and say, oh, wait, why would you do that? But then discussing it and thinking about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. And I thought that I will say this, going into closing and the verdict, my personal feeling was just observing all of this as an observer. It was that the state had raised a lot of very salient points in favor of guilt, but the defense also raised some pretty important questions that I was definitely wondering how the jury was going to interpret that. I didn't think it was a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, when you look at just the bare facts of this case, where you have the defendant admitting that he literally blew the victim's head off.
And you find out the context is a fight over a mailbox and some metal on somebody's field.
You think, well, this is a slam dunk for the prosecution. And the fact that the defense was able to make a real fight of it and was able to raise some very interesting points and that could possibly convince some jurors and we could possibly end up with an acquittal, that's very impressive, and it really speaks to the talent and skills of the criminal defense team led by Andy Baldwin.
Yeah, I thought Andy Baldwin and Kelly Pyle did a really, really excellent job raising the points that could lead to reasonable doubt. And, even in a cut and dry case, that's necessary. Even in a case that could appear at first as cut and dry, that's very necessary because you're trying to challenge the jury, let's really take a look at this and not just accept everything immediately. Let's question it. So that is the role of a defense attorney. And sometimes that means just reacting to the state's case.
Yeah. And it is important to analyze things and just not accept things and just not convict.
In life, not just when you're on a jury, but certainly in life.
Well, as I said, the first closing statement today was provided by Deputy Prosecutor Rob Seet. Why don't you give us some of your impressions of it?
I thought he did a really good job of breaking down the facts of the case. I would describe his demeanor in his closing. I'm always interested in different attorneys, different styles as they present information to the jury and sort of what approach and tack they're going to take in order to kind of have the effect they want. And I felt his manner was very cool, very unflappable, sort of like basically he threw around the word ridiculous a lot when referring to the defense's points and just basically built up this case against Randy Small. He kind of started off by walking them through what is self-defense? What's a believable story of self-defense here? What isn't it? What is murder? He's kind of walking them through some of the basic definitions. Then he's building up from there essentially to kind of go into some of the more salient facts against Small, including like the fact that he's on recordings yelling at one of his brothers, basically like, you snitched on me. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but the meaning was basically, you should not have called the police about this. Not exactly what you would expect to hear from somebody who is claiming self-defense. You would expect somebody claiming self-defense to call the police themselves and say, hey, I shot my neighbor. Here's what happened. I thought he had a gun.
Yeah. And some of as I said, he mentioned 22 reasons. We won't go through them all. 22 reasons why Randy Small is guilty. Others were that Bob Adair, the victim, was not armed. Bob Adair was a frail older gentleman who had a back brace and used a cane and was in a lot of pain in his life. He was a peaceful man. And as he said, he also talked about the lack of remorse shown by Randy Small after the arrest. And one moment in this closing that I thought was effective, he indicated, we don't know what exactly happened between these two men right before the shooting. And Deputy Prosecutor Seet said, who knows what Adair said? What is it now, Randy? Blam. Blam. That's what happened. I thought that was a dramatic moment.
That was dramatic. And I thought he just did a good job of kind of walking them through everything and kind of talking about the body camera footage, talking about Randy's behavior, and really highlighting all of the bad facts against Randy. Just reminding the jury that, like, you may have heard some questioning of some of this, but like, let's stack it all up together, essentially. So I just thought also he just had a very, like, I don't know, kind of like dry manner that I thought was really effective, because it was just like, here are the facts. Let's not get kind of crazy. Let's just kind of sit down and think about this for a minute. So I thought that worked. I don't know. I'm really sleep deprived, so I'm probably not describing it very well. I do apologize, but I that's what I'm trying to convey.
You told me earlier that you felt the two prosecutors had slightly different styles.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
You said Deputy Prosecutor Rob Seet was more analytical and logical, while Prosecutor Adams appealed more to emotions.
Yeah. I thought having both was very effective, because you want the analytical side because you want to kind of walk through, okay, what are the facts, what are the law, like, like let's think about this and analyze it. But you also want the emotion because this was a huge loss for the community, and I think a prosecutor's role is to speak for the victims, and speaking to that loss, speaking to that anguish that Bob Adair's family feels over this loss is really important, giving voice to that while still remaining within reason and talking about the facts as well. I thought that was a good balance that these two prosecutors actually brought.
Before we go any further, I think it's worth pausing for a moment and saying, I believe that the people of Brown County, as well as people who care about the defendant, Randy Small, have every reason to be proud of the performance of the attorneys in this case, both prosecution and defense.
Yeah.
All of the attorneys in this case did an outstanding job. It was very, very well handled on every level.
Yeah, I was really impressed by everyone, honestly. It was like, I was just like, it was nice to see the system working that way, where you have talented people on both sides who are really trying hard to make their case. It's not, no one's rolling over. Nobody's just kind of, it's just people who are like, this is what, I'm going to vigorously defend this client, or I'm going to vigorously attempt to convict this person for, what appears to be a heinous murder. No, it's self-defense. You're seeing this back and forth. And it was really, I think the system works best when you have that vigorous debate and you have talented people. It's not like the talent stacked up on one side or another. It's people who are smart, savvy, know their stuff, are experienced, and are basically going back and forth. And I thought that was kind of wonderful to actually see, despite the fact that it's about such a upsetting and depressing case. Ultimately, that's one thing that I think both of us, Ted Adams, Rob Seet, Kelly Pyle, and Andy Baldwin are all excellent attorneys.
Yes. So speaking of the other attorneys, after Deputy Prosecutor Seet completed his closing argument, the next closing argument was delivered by defense counsel Kelly Pyle.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So Kelly Pyle brought it back to a metaphor she had employed earlier, which got into the Tylenol murders, actually, of 1982, which I don't know if it'll be out by the time this up. I think we're going to cover in the future. So yeah. Spoiler alert. But basically that, you would not, if you basically knew a one tiny pill among 1,000 was poisoned, you would not take that Tylenol bottle. You would report it to the police, hopefully. And basically if there's no percentage of reasonable doubt, it exists or it doesn't exist. If it exists, even if it's small, you have to acquit. So basically explaining the rules of engagement once again to the jury, and then talking about some of the basically lead up and context to the conflict. So we learn a bit more about what preceded some of the animosity in this situation prior to the shooting of Bob Adair. So basically she indicates that Bob Adair was a builder, a woodworker, but I guess there were some building materials of his that were being left on property belonging to Randy Small. So the indication is that set off the fight, and that in retaliation for that, and she admits that this was Randy Small being passive aggressive, he was knocking over Bob Adair's mailbox. One thing that sort of seemed to be like maybe there were some limitations on how far the defense could go with this, and tell me what your interpretation was, but basically indicating that like in conversations with his brother, Ernie Small, Randy Small was like telling him about the situation, and Ernie basically was like, you need to go to the sheriff.
And so she was saying that, well, Ernie wouldn't say go to the sheriff if it was just a regular peaceful dispute. He would say, go get an attorney or something like that. So the fact that he was advising his brother to go to the sheriff has to mean that Randy was telling him things were getting potentially violent. And prosecutor Ted Adams
objected to that.
Because it gets to like a hearsay thing.
Right. It gets to a hearsay thing, but they kind of were like, the defense was kind of getting around that by saying, well, this is a fair interpretation of these events.
This is a reasonable inference, they would say.
Reasonable inference. So we kind of are seeing, there's limits to what exactly can be claimed in these situations. So I think that's what we're seeing there. I don't feel like we'll ever fully, completely understand what exactly was going on here, at least from the trial, because I think one thing people don't understand is that as much as lawyers, criminal lawyers, prosecutors, criminal defense, as much as they imply storytelling techniques, a trial is not a story. A trial is not a situation where the judge sits the jury down and says, okay, I'm going to tell you everything about these two guys and their whole beef and this whole thing, and you're going to learn everything. It's not. And the reason for that is, like, not all of that is evidence that can be used in court. There's going to be gaps. There's going to be areas where the narrative doesn't really explain what happened because it's not useful in court. It's hearsay, or it's tainted evidence in some ways, or it's like maybe the evidence just doesn't exist. Maybe Bob Adair and Randy Small didn't necessarily articulate their problems with each other to the extent that it can explain anything, or if they did, again, it's hearsay and it's just not usable. So I think that's one thing. I think people tend to kind of see trials as like, here's the chance to know everything. And I think that's a misconception. I think it's more of perhaps the beginning of getting answers, and especially in a post-trial situation, maybe piecing everything together in the aftermath. But it's not like it's all just this linear story for everyone to understand. So if you're wondering why exactly did this happen, just know that you're not alone. But that's not what a trial is for. A trial is for saying, did this guy do this, and is it murder or is it self-defense? But anyways, so...
Well, talking about stories, why don't I just go to Kelly Pyle's last line? She says, this is not a case of our story versus their story. It's whether or not you have a reasonable doubt about any element of their story. And then it was time for Andy Baldwin to give his remarks.
Yes. So it opened up with a very moving anecdote that Andy Baldwin told that, kind of got into basically the impact that we all have on one another, and how perhaps a good turn or understanding can really improve the lives of so many down the line. And then the inverse is that maybe that lack of understanding, maybe some cruelty, could negatively affect people down the line, generations down the line. So basically reminding the jury, the way I interpreted that is reminding the jury how important it is to get this right. And if you have any doubt, you have to acquit. You can't just say, well, there's some reasonable doubt here, but let's throw the book at him. That's it. One thing I thought that Baldwin did that was incredibly effective was just noting that, the elephant in the room is that Randy Small blew this neighbor's head off over a property dispute. These people in the jury, they're residents of Brown County. I mean, that should be extra horrifying to them, because it's like, this can happen here, and it could be over something so small. And so he's noting that, like, it's not going to be easy to get an acquittal here. It's not going to be easy because that's not going to be a popular verdict. So I think by acknowledging that, he's kind of being open and honest with the jury and kind of expressing the elephant in the room. You know what I mean? So it's like, let's talk about that. Just because it's unpopular doesn't mean it's wrong to acquit.
Yeah, he kept on saying, it may be difficult for you to explain to people why you would vote to acquit in a case like this, but it's your duty. You have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror a week or so from now and think you did the right thing. And then he started talking at length about the investigation, or rather what he characterized as the lack of investigation into this case. He felt there was a lot of things that police investigators should have done that they didn't do. We talked about how they never measured how far into the field Bob Adair's truck was. You think they would have done that? They didn't. There was lots of omissions. They never did any measurements as to like how high the tractor was. So it wasn't established with certainty, was Randy Small on the tractor or standing when he...
And basically what Andy Baldwin says is the original sin of this case is that this was never, the self-defense angle was never given any oxygen to breathe. Instead of doing some of this investigating that would have perhaps given information that would have pointed to or away from a self-defense situation, those measurements weren't taken, those questions weren't asked early on, and as a result, investigators got tunnel vision and made up their minds early on and said, this is a murder, everything else is out the window, let's take a look.
Yeah, Baldwin said reasonable doubt is a way of holding police accountable, because we want to make sure police do thorough investigations. And they did not do a thorough investigation, he says, in this case. And he responded to the prosecution with saying, oh, Randy Small showed consciousness of guilt, but Andy Baldwin was pointing out other facts which might argue just the opposite. He said Randy Small didn't run or hide after this happened. He said, you know, there's a lake a quarter of a mile away from the shooting site. Randy Small could have dumped the truck into it. He didn't do that. He stuck around.
So noting that, yes, you could characterize some of his statements to his brothers as problematic, but look at what he didn't do. You know, he didn't throw bleach all over the place, and, you know, he perhaps some of his actions, like, you know, like not reporting it right away, could be more explained by shock or some sort of emotional devastation about shooting an unarmed neighbor who you thought was armed, rather than some malicious intent.
And he kept on returning to the point that a bad investigation in and of itself creates reasonable doubt. He says people talk about evidence creating reasonable doubt. He says you could also say that a lack of evidence creates reasonable doubt. And if the police and law enforcement had done a proper job investigating this, there would have been more evidence which might have supported the self-defense claim. Like they didn't even look or analyze, according to the defense, like the tire tracks in the field. You know, did Bob Adair come to a sudden stop where they're skidding? And he said, you know, these are the sorts of things which could have supported the self-defense claim.
And I want to talk about some of this for a moment, because I feel like he raised some really excellent points. And my personal feeling, and I'm marking this as my opinion, so just note that, is that I didn't think that the investigation was bad. I thought in some ways it was actually quite thorough and seemed to get a lot of different things. But at the same time, some of the things about how this all originated with the hectic communication between law enforcement and just all that was going on, and some of the, you know, like not taking some of those measurements, you know, these were reasonable things to raise at the same time. And it was kind of like interesting to hear that, you know, one of the things about a very thorough by the book investigation is that it can kind of quiet a defense strategy later on. So, you know, that kind of thing has to be in like law enforcement's mind when they're doing something, because it's like, you know, maybe it's a outside chance that it's self-defense, but perhaps that should be at least left in the race a little longer, just so you don't get into a situation where you can be accused of having blinders on.
Yeah, I think Baldwin is right. Reasonable doubt is a way to hold police accountable and make them do a more thorough job. And whatever you think, however you come down on the ultimate guilt or innocence of Randy Small, I think it's fair to say that some of these issues that the defense were raising were very valuable.
And you want a defense attorney who's also, you want defense attorneys in this case who are plugged in and are able to look at everything and all these angles and pick out exactly what police messed up. That's a good, because that's going to be the thing that will potentially sway the jury ultimately.
Yeah, he wasn't making stuff up.
No.
These were good, valid issues.
Yeah, and he actually was acknowledging that. I mean, it was not a situation where it's like, oh, it's a conspiracy against my client. It's just genuinely, these were mistakes and shouldn't have happened, but I don't think there's maliciousness involved. So it sounds like he went pretty hard against Detective Brian Schrader in particular. So We didn't witness that, but I think it's a situation where there is a defense strategy to kind of like, okay, you know, this is a hard case and maybe the evidence is stacking up against you, but maybe there was other evidence that would have been better for you. Maybe law enforcement gets attacked. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong in this circumstance, just more pointing out that is that can be an effective strategy, I think, if you're able to really raise specific and reasonable concerns.
And then so the final word in our system goes to the prosecutor. In this case, it was Ted Adams, who got the chance to offer the final closing statement of the day. Again, I thought he did an absolutely superb job.
Yeah, he had a very good, I think, tone. Like, I felt like he brought some of the emotion and some of the, I think you've described it as eloquent anger of a good prosecutor, essentially being able to, you know, kind of speak to what the community and what the family, you know, like might be feeling to a lesser, being able to speak to the tragedy of what happened and like just how his kind of one of his central themes seemed to be that like, is what happened that day reasonable? Can it be construed as a reasonable reaction from Randy Small at all? You know, having this conflict and that ends with your neighbor's head getting blown off and, you know, basically taking it back to, would a person doing self-defense, like what's the threat of a guy sitting there with his hands folded, his feet on the brakes? He's not, you know, he's not like speeding towards you. Why would you do this, basically?
Yeah, I think in a way for Ted Adams, it all came down to what he said in his mini opening statement. A picture's worth 1,000 words. And the picture he referred to was the picture of the headless body of Bob Adair in that truck with his hands folded and his foot on the brake.
He brought up something interesting that I did want to single out, was just that on one of the days we missed, apparently one of Randy Small's brothers actually got a contempt of court charge. So it's just kind of underscores the tragedy of this, because I think the prosecution ended up feeling that the Small brothers or as they referred to them, Team Small, were trying to cover up for their brother Randy, and that some evidence pointed to that. But at the same time, the Small brothers were the people who actually let law enforcement know that this had happened. So I just ended up, I mean, I'm not going to say anybody's guilty or innocent of contempt of court or cover-ups. I just want to say that it's incredibly tragic to be put in a situation where you have to essentially betray your sibling to the police, and then you maybe want to undo that somewhat, so then you're less than forthcoming about other elements. Like, it just, you're in the middle in such an awful way, in a way that I feel like you would be irrevocably changed by. So I'm not advocating for anybody like covering things up or doing that. That's obviously horrible, but I do have some empathy for what a hard and awful position that would be. And the fact that they were the ones who actually came forward with this in the first place, even if it may have been hours later, I don't know. Just the ripple effect of this tragedy, I guess.
It's an awful case.
It like taints everybody.
And it started out for such a trivial thing.
Just a trivia, yeah.
Ted Adams said at one point, this is such a sad reason to get your head blown off.
Yeah.
He said that the defense was trying to use fear to distract the jurors. He wanted them to focus not on Monday morning quarterbacking of police and just focus on what he felt was reasonable. And then it was time for the jury to deliberate.
Before we get into the verdict and are awaiting the verdict, why don't we talk a bit about the judge in this case? I feel like we really haven't talked about her, and obviously she's the one running the show to a certain extent, as judges do in criminal cases. So the judge in this case was the Honorable Mary Wirtz, and she had sort of an interesting style. I felt like in this case, at least, her style was more akin to like a lifeguard than a referee. She's not like necessarily weighing in a ton. She's kind of letting things play out. At least that was my interpretation. Obviously, we're basing this off of one case. She has a whole career, so just take that with a grain of salt. But she was very, very genial with the jury and just kind of talking about, how much she appreciated them and really kind of seemed to be making them feel, comfortable because, they're getting pulled out of their daily lives. These are just ordinary civilians in Brown County. They're getting pulled out of their daily lives to come deal with this awful tragedy, view graphic and horrifying photos, watch loved ones of the victim cry on the stand about this horrible thing that happened to their loved one. And the fate of a man, one of their neighbors essentially, is on their shoulders. Like, that's an intense situation. And I felt like she did a really great job of kind of communicating with them and like letting them know, like, if they needed anything, the court was behind them essentially.
Yeah, I thought she did a great job.
Yeah. She just seemed very even keeled and chilled, to use the modern day parlance.
So the jury went into deliberations. After a few hours, they asked to see some of the body cam video again. In particular, they wanted to see some body cam video which captured. So one of Randy Small's brothers, as we mentioned, went to the United States Police in Pendleton and said, my brother down in Nashville, Indiana, says he shot someone. And at one point during that interaction, all of which was recorded, the trooper had the brother call Randy Small on the phone, and it was a speakerphone, so that the audio of Randy Small was recorded. And in this audio, he was
basically saying, like, I would have gotten away free and clear if you hadn't opened your mouth with law enforcement, essentially. I am not quoting directly. That is a paraphrase. Also, that brings me back, sorry to regress for a moment, but one thing I like that Ted Adams did is this case seemed to have a lot of big posters, big blowout posters of maps mostly, or at least the map, because this is Brown County and this like kind of complicated road and it's in this remote area. But while he was playing some of the audio in his closing statement, he's like holding up these big posters with the quotes on it. And I appreciated that because it's easier for me to read that than hear it from the body camera. So.
And the quotes were quotes from Randy Small in which he was
criticizing his brothers for telling the police.
Yes.
And so basically like, some fucking family and stuff like that, essentially.
So the jury wanted to see that again. And then they also wanted to see some body cam footage of the immediate aftermath after Randy Small comes out of his house after the standoff and interacts with police. How would you describe Randy Small's affect during that encounter with the police immediately after he comes out of the house?
He's very friendly. He's very animated. He's talking with police almost like they've come to his house for a more innocuous reason. Like, oh, hey guys, just make sure to close the door and don't let my dogs out. And like that kind of, and I think the defense's interpretation of some of that would be a man in shock who's like going through some real mental turmoil. I think the prosecution's characterization is that's really cold and he's obviously just trying to cover up his crime and, kind of distract them by like, it's all fine here. So, but you do see that kind of normalcy, or he seems a little manic to me personally, because it's kind of like, you're almost way too happy for the situation. But I think that could go either way. It's not talking about his guilt or innocence.
So the jury watches those videos. They go back into the jury room. And
I gotta say, yeah.
What were you going to say?
I was going to say, I wrote down at this point to you, because I'm taking notes, but I'm also, so sometimes Kevin and I are writing notes back and forth. I wrote, is them asking for this good or bad for the defense, do you think? And we were kind of going back and forth about that, because we were thinking, on the one hand, it does some of the statements by police do indicate that they kind of went against the self-defense thing pretty early, because Randy was essentially telling his brothers, don't snitch on me. And they were like, why would you say that if it was just self-defense? And so that might be good for the defense. But then the other...
Yeah, so the state troopers in Pendleton who were just talking to Randy Small's brother, not even interacting with Randy Small at all, seemed to immediately jump to the conclusion that the self-defense claim was bogus.
In fairness, they did hear him say, basically, how dare you tell the police, you know,
But
I would have gotten away with it.
But they jumped to that conclusion even before that.
Right. I think the feeling was like, why would somebody do this and then not call the police themselves if they were in the right? So, but again, the defense is saying, well, maybe he's in shock. Maybe he's having a mental breakdown.
So the jury goes back to deliberate some more, and it's not that long later, certainly about 5-10 minutes later, there's a knock at the door and they've reached a verdict.
Yeah, we heard the bailiff say verdict and we were like, oh, here we go. And it was a situation where I think they were gone for a total of 3 hours?
Something like that.
Something like that.
What was the verdict?
Guilty. Guilty of murder. There were no other charges offered. It was just murder. I know we were kind of thinking, okay, is there going to be some situation where we have to acquit him of murder, but we would have gone for a manslaughter thing. You could see that happening. But in this case, they felt the prosecution proved murder.
It was a very somber mood in the courthouse.
Yeah, it wasn't, the judge admonished everybody, don't react. That's one thing. People say, oh, why doesn't the defendant break down crying or something? You're really advised not to do that. It's supposed to be a somber moment. So most judges explicitly say, do not do that. And, you don't want to mess yourself up. And nobody, ultimately, Bob Adair is dead and nothing will bring him back. And this doesn't make that better. His absence is keenly felt, obviously, by people who cared for them. So it's like, you can't, perhaps there's justice, but is there, that doesn't mean that people who loved him get him back. So it's just very somber. It's very sad. It's just like a sad, awful. It was
very somber and sad. And then after
I noted that, I felt the defense looked pretty crushed, and I could understand that. And I feel like, from what we understood, interviewing some of Andy Baldwin's colleagues, I feel like there's a genuine empathy that he has for his clients in these situations. And there's a real desire to help them. And in a situation where you've been fighting to help somebody escape a very lengthy prison sentence, and that comes down a different way, that's got to be pretty crushing. And I think the empathy speaks well, though, because I think it would be pretty easy to sort of deaden that over time and not necessarily have that empathy, try to use your skills, but not necessarily have that. But I think maintaining that is very, that's special.
I would hope the defense at least takes comfort in the fact that their performance was extraordinary.
I felt I guess we could talk a little bit about our own opinions on the case, since we've kind of recapped all the news.
Right.
I felt that the actions of Randy Small pointed more to a murder. And I was not surprised by the conviction. I felt like, given how long the jury was gone, it seemed like they did really grapple with the question of, could the investigation have been tainted? But I felt like I wasn't surprised by the call ultimately. But I felt the defense did a really good job pushing for the possibility of reasonable doubt here. And I felt like they made some really compelling arguments.
I was thinking there was more than a realistic chance that they might have acquitted him.
I felt like they came closer than a lot of other people would have. But I felt the prosecution did an excellent job of putting this all together.
Yeah, again, all of the legal team on both sides did a great job.
Yeah, Ted Adams and Rob Seet really did a very commendable job.
And Andrew Baldwin and Kelly Pyle did an extraordinary job as well. After we filed out of the courtroom, we decided to do something we hadn't done yet, which was actually to go and look at the scene of the shooting.
Yes, and we drove up this really, very Brown County gravel road, uphill. Kevin hates driving in Brown County because it's a lot of narrow, twisty roads. I love it because I'm, nuts. And we kind of went through, it's really like dense forest. Like you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. And we finally got to Helm Road after going down Crooked Creek. And we parked there. We didn't want to go down Helm Road or anything. We didn't want to drive down it and disturb anybody, but we just wanted to look at it and sort of see it for ourselves. And it just struck me how sad it is that because of this act of violence, Randy Small, for the property that he cared so much about to the point where he blasted a man's head off over it, he's probably never going to get to go back to that property unless his appeal goes well, I suppose. But there's a huge chance that he will not ever see it again. And then with Bob Adair, who by all accounts was this beloved musician and artist and person, family member, he had a grandchild, who should have been enjoying his golden years at this point, instead died in such a brutal and senseless manner. He never gets to go back either. And I don't know, it just like there's no happy ending to a situation like this. It's just more pain. And I just feel so sorry for the family of Bob Adair in particular. And I just feel so sorry for everybody affected by this situation, because it just seems like one of those things. It's just, crimes often get called senseless. So I'm just being cliched here, but I really can't think of another word for something like this, where it's just like, I don't know, this act of violence, just, I don't know, just being out there looking at it just drove that home for me. Before we go, we just wanted to say thank you so much to the Brown County Courthouse staff, who were super wonderful and helpful during our time.
They were very patient with us.
They were very patient with us. And so shout out to them. Thanks so much. And if there's a court case going on that you think we should cover, let us know.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening. Hello, Murder Sheet listeners. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. Just wanted to take a moment as we close out to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. They are #1 for a reason, folks. Kevin and I have been loving the meals we're getting from HelloFresh. We're talking farm fresh produce, protein, all sorts of customizable options to get you exactly what you and your family need. It's very delicious, it's very nutritious, and it's quite affordable. So it ticks off all our boxes. We've been very happy with the service. And, would love for you guys to try it out if you're curious, or if you've tried it out in the past and enjoyed it, get that discount. It's hellofresh.com/msheet16. And then you're going to plug in the code msheet16. You get 16 free meals plus free shipping. You can't beat that. We've really been delighted by it. We work very hard on the podcast. It takes up a lot of time. It's our small business. We really enjoy the work. We enjoy conversing with all of you every week. But at the same time, it's nice for Kevin and I to kind of have something to do outside of office hours, and cooking these meals has been really fun. We're terrible in the kitchen, disastrous. I can tell you horror stories. I probably shouldn't get into it on the podcast, but I mean, some pretty disastrous moments involving our cooking. Nothing life threatening, but definitely stuff that we tried to be overly ambitious about. And it either went horribly wrong or it ended up costing like way more than it should have because we didn't properly like think about ingredients. And we're not gifted in the realm of the kitchen, but HelloFresh makes us pretend like we are because everything is so pre-portioned and pre-planned and the instructions are super clear. So like, you're not going to mess it up if you're like us. And if you're good in the kitchen, then it's just less of a hassle and you get everything that you need. You don't have to run out to the grocery store. So super nice. Try it out. I've really enjoyed the meals that they've sent us so far. I can say that Kevin has too. I highlight that because Kevin is pretty picky when it comes to food. He does not like everything. He has pretty strong specifications and preferences. Very much cares about things like fresh produce and farm produce and things like that. So he's very picky. And I think the fact that he is really enjoying HelloFresh is a testament to the quality here because he's a stickler for that kind of thing. And so if you are, I think you will enjoy it as well. And again, the URL and promo code that'll get you a sweet discount is hellofresh.com/msheet16. That's MSHEET 16. And use code MSHEET16. You're going to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. We hope you enjoy it. And again,